Have you ever wondered what you'd do if the person who shattered your life suddenly ended up depending on you for theirs? Because that's exactly what happened to me. But before we begin, if you enjoy emotional stories filled with betrayal, heartbreak, unexpected twists, and unforgettable comebacks, make sure to like this video, subscribe to Revenge Stories with Rinsola, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story. And while you're watching, I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you've ever experienced betrayal, or if you think you know what Ella should do when fate brings her face to face with the man who destroyed her life, leave a comment below. Now, let me tell you how one simple introduction to my best friend changed my life forever. On a warm Tuesday morning in downtown Dallas, Texas, I stood inside the glass-walled executive office of Carter Logistics, watching flashing red and blue emergency lights surround one of my company's overturned 18-wheelers. From the 22nd floor, the scene looked almost unreal. Police officers moved quickly. Paramedics rushed a stretcher toward an ambulance. Employees stood frozen in the parking lot, whispering among themselves. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. My operations manager stepped inside, looking unusually tense. In his hand was an employee file. "Ella," he said quietly, "the driver survived. He's in surgery now, but before they took him in, he kept saying he wanted to personally thank the CEO. He refused to leave until someone promised he'd get the chance." I nodded, more concerned about the condition of one of my employees than anything else. "Is his family on the way?" I asked. "Yes," he replied. "But I think you should see this first." He placed the file on my desk. I opened it without thinking. Then I stopped breathing. The name staring back at me was one I'd spent years trying to forget. Ethan Brooks. The man I had loved for 9 years. The man who walked away from me just 14 days before our wedding. The man who chose my best friend instead. For a moment, the sounds outside my office disappeared. The ambulances. The radios. The city below. Everything faded into silence. How could Ethan be working for my company? Did he know Carter Logistics belonged to me? Or had fate quietly brought us back together for a reason neither of us could have imagined? To answer that, I have to take you back to the beginning, long before I became a CEO, back to a time when I believed love alone could protect a person's heart. 9 years earlier, my life looked nothing like it does today. Back then, I was simply Ella Carter, a freshman at the University of Texas at Dallas with big dreams, a second-hand car that barely started, and a notebook full of goals I hoped one day to accomplish. I believed that if you worked hard enough and treated people with kindness, life would eventually reward you. Then I met Ethan Brooks. He wasn't the loudest guy on campus or the kind of man who demanded attention when he walked into a room. What drew people to him was something much quieter. He listened before he spoke. He remembered little details about people. He had a calm confidence that made everyone around him feel comfortable. We met during orientation after I accidentally dropped a stack of books across the student center floor. Before I could even bend down to pick them up, someone was already kneeling beside me. "You've got enough to carry," he said with a smile. "Mind if I help?" That simple moment turned into a conversation. The conversation turned into coffee. Coffee became late-night study sessions. Study sessions became weekend road trips across Texas. And before either of us realized it, we'd fallen completely in love. For the next 9 years, Ethan wasn't just my boyfriend. He was my best friend. He celebrated every promotion I earned. He comforted me after every disappointment. When my father underwent surgery, Ethan stayed with my family at the hospital until dawn. When he struggled to find stable work after graduation, I never once judged him. I believed relationships weren't measured by who earned more money but by who stayed when life became difficult. Everyone around us admired what we had. Friends joked that we'd probably grow old arguing over whose turn it was to make coffee every morning. Even our families stopped asking if we'd get married. They only asked when. That answer finally came one autumn evening. As the sun set over White Rock Lake, Ethan got down on one knee and held out a ring. His hands were shaking. So. He laughed nervously. You've already spent 9 years putting up with me. Think you could handle forever? I didn't even let him finish. I threw my arms around him and said yes before he could close the ring box. It felt like every dream I'd ever carried had finally become real. The following months were filled with excitement. Wedding invitations were mailed. The venue was reserved. The florist was booked. My dress was carefully chosen after weeks of searching. Every conversation was about our future together. Every plan felt like another step toward the life we'd spent nearly a decade building. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder if life gives us quiet warnings before everything changes. Maybe it does. Maybe I simply refuse to see them. Because just when I believed nothing could ever come between us, someone from my past knocked on my front door. Someone I trusted as much as I trusted Ethan. Her name was Vanessa. And I had absolutely no idea that opening that door would become the biggest mistake of my life. If someone had asked me back then who I trusted most in the world, my answer would have been simple. Ethan. And right after him, Vanessa. Vanessa Miller and I had been inseparable during high school. We weren't just friends, we were sisters in every way that mattered. We shared secrets, dreams, heartbreaks, and the kind of memories only teenagers could create together. But after graduation, life pulled us in different directions. She moved away with her family. I stayed in Texas for college. Over the years, our conversations became less frequent until they eventually stopped altogether. I never blamed her. Life happens. People grow apart. At least, that's what I believed. Then one Saturday afternoon, just 3 months before my wedding, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number. Hello? There was a brief silence before a familiar voice laughed. You're really going to pretend you don't remember your favorite troublemaker? I nearly screamed. Vanessa? She laughed again. You haven't forgotten me after all. It turned out she had accepted a temporary marketing contract in Dallas and would be staying in the city for several months. I was genuinely excited. It felt like life was giving me back an old friend just before one of the happiest moments of my life. A few days later, we met for lunch. The conversation flowed as though no time had passed. We laughed over embarrassing high school memories. Talked about teachers we used to imitate. Even finished each other's sentences. Before leaving the restaurant, I smiled and said, "You have to meet Ethan." That evening, I invited her over to our apartment. The moment Ethan walked through the front door carrying takeout, I proudly introduced them. Ethan, this is Vanessa. We've been best friends since we were 16. He smiled politely. It's nice to finally meet the person I've heard so much about. Vanessa smiled back. I was beginning to think Ella made you up. We all laughed. Looking back now, that laugh still echoes in my mind. At first, everything seemed perfectly normal. Vanessa started visiting more often. Sometimes we'd cook dinner together. Sometimes we'd discuss wedding decorations for hours. She offered to help me choose flowers, table settings, music, even wedding favors. I thought I was lucky. Not every bride gets to plan her wedding with her childhood best friend. Ethan also seemed happy that we had reconnected. The three of us spent weekends together. We visited venues. Sampled cakes. Compared invitation designs. From the outside, we probably looked like three close friends preparing for the happiest day of someone's life. But little by little, things began changing. It started with small moments. I'd walk into the living room and Ethan would quickly lock his phone. Vanessa would suddenly stop talking whenever I entered the room. Late at night, Ethan's phone would buzz. He'd glance at the screen. Smile. Then say it was just work. Whenever I asked if everything was okay, he'd kiss my forehead and tell me I was imagining things. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? After 9 years together, trust wasn't something I questioned. I ignored every warning sign because I never imagined the two people I loved most would ever betray me. Then, exactly 2 weeks before my wedding, Ethan called. His voice sounded strangely empty. "Can we meet?" There was something about those 3 words that made my stomach tighten. I had no idea. That conversation was about to destroy the life I'd spent nearly a decade building. I still remember the cafe where Ethan asked me to meet him. It was the same little place where we'd celebrated our first anniversary years earlier. Back then, we'd talked about traveling the world together. This time, he could barely look me in the eyes. When I sat down across from him, I smiled. "So, are we here to argue about the guest list again?" He didn't smile back. Instead, he stared at the coffee sitting untouched in front of him. Then he quietly said, "Ella, we need to cancel the wedding." For a second, I honestly thought he was joking. I even laughed. Very funny. But he didn't laugh with me. The silence that followed told me everything. "What do you mean?" I whispered. He took a slow breath. "I can't marry you." My heart started pounding. "Why?" He finally looked up. "I'm in love with someone else." The words hit harder than I could ever describe. I felt like the entire room had disappeared around us. My voice trembled. "Who?" He closed his eyes for a moment before answering. "Vanessa." Everything inside me shattered. "No." I shook my head over and over. "No, that's impossible." He didn't deny it. He didn't apologize. He simply nodded. "We didn't plan for it to happen." I stared at him in disbelief. "You were supposed to marry me." "I know." "Then why?" His answer was one I would never forget. "Because I think she's the person I'm meant to spend my life with." 9 years. Gone in a single sentence. I begged him to reconsider. I reminded him of everything we'd built together. The dreams. The promises. The family we'd planned. He listened quietly. Then stood up. "I'm sorry, Ella." And just like that, he walked away. I never imagined that would be the last time I'd see the man I loved. But the nightmare was only beginning. Within days, rumors spread throughout Dallas. Friends began calling. Family members demanded answers. Social media filled in the details before I even understood what had happened. Some people sympathized with me. Others treated my heartbreak like entertainment. Then came the final blow. A mutual friend accidentally sent me a photograph. At first, I couldn't understand what I was looking at. Then my hands began shaking. It was my wedding venue. The same ballroom I had spent months decorating. The same flowers I had personally chosen. The same date printed on every invitation. Standing at the altar was Ethan. Beside him, Vanessa. She was wearing the wedding dress I had spent weeks searching for. The dress I had dreamed of walking down the aisle in. Guests who had once planned to celebrate my future were now applauding theirs. I dropped my phone onto the floor. For a long time, I simply stared into nothing. That was the moment I realized something terrifying. They hadn't just stolen the man I loved. They had stolen the future I believed belonged to me. And I had no idea. Life was about to take even more from me. There are moments in life when pain is so overwhelming that it no longer feels real. After Ethan and Vanessa's wedding, I stopped recognizing the woman staring back at me in the mirror. The sparkle in my eyes disappeared. The excitement that had once filled my mornings was gone. Even getting out of bed felt like climbing a mountain. Friends called. I ignored them. Family knocked on my apartment door. I pretended I wasn't home. People tried to comfort me, but every kind word only reminded me of everything I had lost. The hardest part wasn't losing Ethan. It was losing my trust. The two people I loved most had looked me in the eyes every day while hiding the truth. That thought haunted me more than the betrayal itself. Days turned into weeks. I barely ate. I barely slept. Sometimes I'd sit on my couch for hours, staring at the engagement ring lying on the coffee table, wondering how a future that once seemed so certain had disappeared overnight. Then came the afternoon that changed my life forever. Dark clouds covered downtown Dallas. A steady rain had been falling for hours, but I hardly noticed. I left my apartment without an umbrella. Without a destination. I just walked. The city around me felt distant. Car horns. Traffic lights. People rushing home from work. Everything sounded muffled, as if I were underwater. My mind replayed the same memories over and over. The proposal. The wedding plans. The lies. The wedding photographs I never wanted to see. By the time I reached one of the busiest intersections downtown, tears had blurred my vision. The pedestrian signal was still red. I never saw it. I stepped off the curb without thinking. Someone screamed. Brakes screeched. Then, everything went black. When I finally opened my eyes, the world smelled like antiseptic and sounded like machines. Bright hospital lights stared back at me. My head throbbed. My entire body ached. A doctor stood beside my bed with an expression that told me my life had changed forever. "Ella," he said gently, "the accident caused severe damage to your left leg. We did everything we could." He paused. "But we couldn't save it." The words echoed through my mind. Couldn't save it. I slowly looked beneath the blanket. My leg was gone. For a long time I couldn't cry. I couldn't even speak. I simply stared at the ceiling, wondering how life had managed to take away everything I loved in such a short time. Still, part of me believed Ethan would come. Maybe once he heard about the accident. Maybe he'd remember the woman he once promised to spend forever with. Every morning I asked the nurses if anyone had visited. Every afternoon I looked toward the hospital door. Every evening I waited. Day after day. No Ethan. No Vanessa. Nothing. Then one quiet morning, a nurse walked into my room carrying a small padded envelope. "There wasn't a return address," she said. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was my engagement ring. Nothing else. No letter. No apology. No explanation. Just the ring. I stared at it for what felt like hours before quietly closing the box. And in that silent hospital room, I made the hardest decision of my life. If no one was coming to save me, then I would save myself. The first victory wasn't starting a company. It wasn't making money. It wasn't becoming successful. The first victory was learning to stand again. After weeks of surgery and months of physical therapy, I took my first steps using a prosthetic leg. Every step hurt. Sometimes I fell. Sometimes I wanted to quit. But every time I remembered the woman lying helpless in that hospital bed. I forced myself to take one more step. Then another. Eventually, walking became easier. But rebuilding my confidence took much longer. I realized something during those long months of recovery. The people who betrayed me had already taken enough. They had stolen my relationship. My wedding. My peace. I refused to let them steal my future too. So instead of asking why my life had fallen apart, I began asking what I could build from what remained. I spent countless hours reading books on leadership, business, and logistics. I enrolled in online business courses. I attended networking events even when I felt completely out of place. Little by little, I started believing in myself again. With the savings I'd managed to keep, and a small business loan, I purchased a single-used freight truck. People thought I was crazy. Some relatives warned me not to risk everything. Others quietly assumed I'd fail within a year. Maybe they were right to doubt me. I had no experience running a transportation company. There were days when I questioned myself too. Contracts fell through. Repairs drained my savings. Fuel prices climbed. Some nights I slept inside my tiny office because I couldn't afford both rent and payroll. But every setback taught me something. Every mistake made me stronger. One truck became two. Two became five. Five became 15. Then 25. Years passed. The little company I started with fear and determination slowly transformed into Carter Logistics. Businesses across Texas trusted us because we delivered on time and treated people fairly. Drivers wanted to work for us because they knew they'd be respected. Clients stayed because we kept our promises. As the company grew, so did I. I no longer saw my prosthetic leg as a reminder of what I'd lost. It became proof of everything I'd survived. Within a few years, Carter Logistics had expanded beyond Dallas into neighboring cities and eventually across multiple states. Our fleet grew to more than 100 trucks. Industry magazines began calling me one of the youngest female CEOs in Texas. Ironically, very few employees had ever met me in person. Most only knew me through company newsletters and annual board meetings. My reputation traveled farther than my face. And that anonymity would soon change everything. Because while my business was reaching heights I had never imagined, the lives Ethan and Vanessa had chosen over mine were quietly falling apart. Neither of them had any idea that fate was already preparing to bring us together again. People often assume that the hardest part of betrayal is watching the people who hurt you move on. In my experience, the hardest part is realizing that life keeps moving, whether you're ready or not. For years, I knew almost nothing about Ethan and Vanessa. I never searched for them online. I never asked mutual friends how they were doing. I never drove past the house where they lived. The chapter they wrote with me had already ended. I was determined not to become a footnote in theirs. Instead, every ounce of my energy went into Carter Logistics. As the company expanded, so did my responsibilities. Board meetings replaced therapy sessions. Business conferences replaced lonely weekends. Every new contract reminded me that my future no longer depended on anyone else's choices. Ironically, while my life was finally moving forward, Ethan's was slowly unraveling. I didn't learn the details until much later. After marrying Vanessa, life wasn't the fairy tale either of them had imagined. The excitement that had begun with stolen romance quickly faded under the weight of everyday reality. Money became a constant source of arguments. A small business Ethan invested in collapsed after less than 2 years. Their savings disappeared trying to keep it afloat. Credit card balances grew. Loan payments piled up. Eventually, they were forced to sell their home. The marriage that had once been built on excitement slowly became consumed by stress, disappointment, and regret. For the first time in his adult life, Ethan found himself desperately searching for stable work. He applied everywhere. Construction companies, warehouses, delivery services. Some never called him back. Others rejected him after interviews. Then one afternoon, he noticed an opening for experienced truck drivers at Carter Logistics. The company had a reputation for treating employees well. The pay was competitive. The benefits were excellent. To Ethan, it looked like the opportunity he had been praying for. He submitted his application. A week later, he received a phone call. He'd been hired. What he didn't know was that the woman who owned the company was the same woman whose heart he had shattered years earlier. Because I rarely handled hiring for entry-level employees, I never saw his application. Everything went through human resources. His name never crossed my desk. Months passed. Ethan proved himself to be one of our most dependable drivers. He showed up early. Worked overtime without complaining. Never missed a delivery. His supervisors often praised his professionalism. One afternoon, while chatting with a dispatcher after finishing a long haul, Ethan looked up at the Carter Logistics headquarters and smiled. "You know," he said, "I've worked for a lot of companies over the years. The dispatcher laughed. So have most of us. But this one feels different, Ethan continued. Whoever built this place, they must be one incredible leader. The dispatcher grinned. Our CEO doesn't like the spotlight. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. I hope I get the chance to shake their hand one day. He had no idea that fate was already arranging that meeting. Nearly 7 years had passed since Ethan walked away from our wedding. By then, Carter Logistics operated around the clock. More than 100 trucks crossed highways throughout Texas and neighboring states every single day. Most mornings followed the same routine. Safety reports, financial meetings, expansion plans, employee updates. Everything was carefully organized. Until one phone call changed everything. It was just after 2:30 in the morning when my phone rang. No CEO enjoys receiving calls at that hour. They almost always mean something has gone terribly wrong. I answered immediately. Ella, my operations manager said, his voice unusually tense. We've had a serious accident. My heart sank. How bad? One of our trucks was involved in a collision on Interstate 35. According to the Highway Patrol, the driver swerved to avoid a family whose SUV had lost control during the rain. I closed my eyes. Did everyone survive? The family wasn't injured. I exhaled slowly. And our driver? There was a pause. He's alive, but barely. Within minutes I was on my way to headquarters. By sunrise, the executive conference room had filled with managers reviewing accident reports, insurance information, and emergency response updates. The preliminary investigation showed that our driver hadn't been speeding. He hadn't been distracted. In fact, investigators believed his quick decision had likely saved the lives of the family in the other vehicle. The truck, however, was completely destroyed. As CEO, I personally approved emergency medical funding for employees involved in catastrophic workplace accidents. My operations manager placed the employee file on the conference table. I'll need your authorization. Without looking up, I reached for the folder. Then I opened it. The photograph stared back at me. Older. More tired. A few gray hairs beginning to appear around his temples. But there was no mistaking him. Ethan Brooks. For several long seconds, no one spoke. I simply stared at the file. The room around me seemed to disappear. Memories flooded back all at once. The proposal. The wedding invitations. The empty hospital room. The engagement ring arriving without a single word. Then, I quietly closed the folder. The managers watched my expression, uncertain what I was thinking. No one in that room knew the history hidden behind that photograph. No one knew that the injured driver had once been the man I planned to spend my life with. I finally broke the silence. Authorize the best trauma surgeons available. The operations manager nodded. And his insurance coverage? I looked directly at him. If insurance doesn't cover everything. I paused. The company will. His recovery was slow, but every day he grew stronger. The first thing he asked his manager after returning home was something no one expected. I'd like to personally thank the CEO. His manager smiled. I'll send the request. Several days later, the answer came back. Approved. On the morning of the meeting, Ethan put on the only suit he still owned. It had been years since he'd worn it. The jacket fit a little tighter than he remembered. The fabric had begun to show its age. Still, it was the best he had. Vanessa insisted on coming with him. I owe that person my thanks too, she said quietly. Neither of them knew what waited behind the doors of the executive office. As the elevator climbed toward the top floor of Carter Logistics headquarters, Ethan's hands grew damp with nervousness. I wonder what the CEO is like, he whispered. Vanessa managed a weak smile. I guess we're about to find out. The receptionist welcomed them and asked them to wait. A few moments later, the office doors slowly opened. They stepped inside. The room was elegant but simple. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Dallas skyline. Awards lined one wall. Photographs of company drivers and employees decorated another. Then they heard footsteps. Slow. Steady. Confident. Both of them turned. A woman walked toward them wearing a navy blue business suit. Her posture was straight. Her expression was calm. A modern prosthetic leg moved naturally beneath her tailored trousers, each step carrying quiet confidence instead of hesitation. For a brief moment, neither Ethan nor Vanessa recognized her. Then their eyes met. Time seemed to stop. "Ella," Ethan whispered. The color drained from his face. Vanessa covered her mouth as tears instantly filled her eyes. Neither of them had imagined this. The woman whose future they had destroyed had become the person who saved his life. For several long seconds, no one spoke. The silence inside the office felt heavier than any words could have been. Ethan stared at Ella, struggling to believe what he was seeing. The shy young woman he had once known was gone. Standing before him was someone transformed by years of resilience, discipline, and determination. She looked strong. Not because life had been kind to her, but because she had survived when life hadn't been. Finally, Ethan lowered his head. "I don't know where to begin," he said quietly. Ella remained calm. "You can begin with the truth." He nodded. "I made the biggest mistake of my life." His voice trembled. "I thought I was chasing happiness. Instead, I threw away the best person I'd ever known." Vanessa wiped away tears before speaking. "I betrayed the one friend who always stood by me. There isn't a single year that's passed without me regretting what I did." Ella listened without interrupting. There was no anger in her expression. Only peace. Ethan looked around the office. The awards. The photographs. The view of hundreds of Carter Logistics trucks leaving the distribution center below. A future he had never imagined. A future he had once assumed would include him. "If I could go back," he whispered, "I'd make a different choice." Ella looked at him for a long moment. Then she smiled gently. "I believe you." The words caught him by surprise. "But," she continued, "life doesn't give us the chance to live the same chapter twice." She walked toward the window overlooking the fleet of trucks. "When you left, I thought my life was over." She paused. "I lost my fiancé. My best friend. My confidence. And after the accident." She glanced briefly toward her prosthetic leg. "I almost lost myself." She turned back to face them. "But somewhere along the way, I realized something. My future didn't belong to the people who hurt me. It belonged to the person I chose to become." Neither Ethan nor Vanessa could lift their eyes. Ella reached for a folder on her desk. "Your remaining medical expenses have already been paid." Ethan looked up in surprise. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." "Why?" Ella smiled softly. "Because helping someone in need says more about my character than your past says about yours." Tears rolled down Vanessa's face. "I'm so sorry, Ella." "I know. I don't expect you to forgive us." Ella nodded thoughtfully. "I already have." Both of them looked stunned. "But forgiveness," she added gently, "doesn't mean pretending the past never happened. It means refusing to let it control my future." She wished them both good health and hoped they would rebuild their lives with honesty and compassion. There was no offer to rekindle old friendships. No promise of a second chance. Some doors, once closed, remain closed. Not out of bitterness, but out of wisdom. As Ethan and Vanessa left the office, they passed rows of employees proudly wearing Carter Logistics uniforms. Outside, dozens of trucks rolled through the company gates, each one a reminder of what Ella had built from the broken pieces of her life. For the first time, Ethan truly understood what he had lost. Not just a relationship, but a remarkable woman whose strength he had failed to appreciate until it was far too late. Back inside her office, Ella watched the trucks disappear into the distance beneath the Dallas skyline. A quiet smile crossed her face. She no longer carried the weight of betrayal. She carried something far greater. Peace. Because in the end, the greatest revenge wasn't making the people who hurt her suffer. It was refusing to let their choices define the rest of her life. And sometimes, the happiest ending isn't getting back what you lost. It's discovering that what lies ahead is even better than what you left behind. This is Revenge Stories with Rinsola, where every betrayal has a lesson, every heartbreak leads to a comeback, and every ending reminds us that karma has a way of catching up. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, give this video a thumbs up, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another unforgettable revenge story. Your support means the world to this channel and encourages us to keep bringing you powerful stories of betrayal, resilience, and redemption. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.